Oh, thank you for having me. So what happened is I've been writing this paper. Valentina and I have been writing this paper for at least 5 or 6 years. We've been putting it aside and bringing it back. So one of the things that happened to us is that we went to, I went to this thing by the Council of Foreign Relations on what the 1930s had to say about the modern situation. And so they had Robert Lucas and they had Ed Prescott and all these people, and then there was me. So it wasn't quite like, you know, I was way out of my depth. So, but what's that? But I have data. That's exactly right. I have no model, but I have a data. So that's the key. And so, so what happens is all the discussion turns out to be about the multiplier, you know, and no one's talked about the multiplier for at least 30 years, as far as I could tell. And so the Minnesota macro people said the multiplier was 0. Barrow wasn't there, but they cited Barrow as saying it was 0.6. Lucas said, I can't remember what Lucas said he thought it was, 0.8 or maybe 0 in the long run. And then they cited this Moody's multiplier, and they said it was by Mark Zandi, and said it was 1.6. And so that was the one. So journalists actually read this one out, and everybody scoffed and stuff. And so I said, well, I can actually estimate multipliers. But it turns out the multiplier I'm going to estimate today is a state multiplier. So it's more about, not a macro multiplier. It's more about how hard should you work to try to get money from the federal government to stimulate your economy. Okay, so one of the things about this, what struck me about this, is in the 1930s, you know, people talk about the multiplier sense. Question?
Well, so even when it's a state multiplier, I mean, for a lot of questions, do you want to just interpret that as like a small, like
it's a small open economy.
Right.
The one difference
the question is whether you have ideas of people moving, that would be the difference between a small open economy. People are moving in or out, or things like that.
Right, and so one good thing about the 30s for this is that there was some mobility, but it's probably the least mobile period of the whole 20th century in terms of people moving. The difference between this and the macro multiplier and the following, it's more like the IMF comes in and gives you a bunch of money. Okay, and so there's no guarantee that you're going to be on the hook for like the long-term situation, like one of Barrow's Ricardian equivalence problems or something like that. So essentially what's happening is they're giving you money. You might pay for it to some extent with taxes, but you may not be paying for it either. And we're going to talk about taxes as well.
So can I just ask you, so when you said that the 1930s was a period of low geographic mobility, is that like...
It's not like they couldn't move, they just didn't move.
It's natural. Is that relative to like the 1920s or just...
It's relative to... Okay, so if you look at almost any decade in the 20th century, the mobility, the amount of movement during the 1930s was about half what it was in most other decades in the 20th century. Okay, now we did studies about mobility, and actually we argued it was still mobile because we wanted to publish the paper about mobility, but it was a lot smaller than it was in almost any other decade. So one thing about this is I have this, In Search Of I got this idea for In Search Of because it was kind of like when Leonard Nimoy became unemployed after being Spock for 2 years. He went on this television show called In Search Of, and they always went in search of all sorts of things. And so my favorite one of those was the Easter Island one. So think about these headstones as being all those famous macroeconomists who estimated multipliers all the time in the past. So I wanted to do this with a voiceover, you know, Keynes, Samuelson, but it didn't quite work out that way. Okay. So the Great Recession, the modern Great Recession, has certainly generated a great deal of interest in the Great Depression. So once people discovered that I did work on the Great Depression, I get all sorts of phone calls whenever they think the recession's heating up again. So you can treat me like a leading indicator in the economy. So the good thing about this is that I haven't been getting very many phone calls lately, so that's a good sign that things are improving overall. So here's what we do. I'm going to summarize what we do up front, and then we'll come back through. So we look at multipliers for state income related to net federal spending and also to direct federal spending during the New Deal. So the way this works is we put together data on federal spending from an agency known as the Office of Government Reports, which is my favorite agency of all time. Because they accumulated all these reports in one spot, and then they try to report all this information. Now, the Office of Government Reports, though, didn't go out and publish a bunch of papers about what was going on. They published memeos that were distributed inside the federal government. And I think they used it for publicity purposes and things like this. Now, it turns out that it didn't include all that we thought it did originally, and so we went back and we rechecked all the data sources for the original Office of Government Reports. And we also expanded the data to go out to 1930 and also to go out to 1940. So this is why this paper has become like, I feel like Ahab chasing, Moby Dick or something like this, because it just never seems to end. So what we do is we estimate the multiplier for the states in a model with extreme weather correlates. So we wanted to take into account weather shocks and things like this, which do seem to have an effect on the economy. We also control for state and year effects, and we also try some stuff with state time trends. The ultimate thing is that if we're going to get any kind of, because of negative endogeneity bias, if you're ever going to find a positive multiplier, you're going to have instruments to find it. And so we actually do instrumental variables techniques. We do this for a variety of measures of economic activity and a variety of definitions of government spending, because it turns out that there are a lot of different ways to measure income, and there are a lot of different ways to measure government spending, and it's not always all that clear exactly what the right way to do it is. So this paper keeps expanding. I think Mauricio was complaining to me about being 90 pages long or something. Well, most of that is the appendix, which seems to be twice as long as the paper, and the appendix is going to get longer still. So here are the results. The results we get, the multiplier we get, ranges somewhere between 0.8. Now what that means is that if you spend an extra dollar in that state from the federal government, the income in the economy in that state will go up by 0.8. So you get a 20% crowding out. Okay? It could be as high as 1.6. So spend a dollar, you get that dollar back, get an additional dollar, you get that dollar, plus you get 67 cents on top of that. So 67 cents is the spillover. Okay, we also do this for the wage and salary income. One reason we focus on wage and salary income is that personal income includes transfer payments, and most macroeconomists don't talk about these multipliers with a measure with transfer payments included. And I'm in the middle of, and I thought that I'd finished calculating the personal income without transfer payments, but I discovered a flaw on the flight out here. So that wasted 5 hours of the flight. I didn't quite finish. So anyway, we'll be able to fix that soon. When we look at wage and salary income, that actually is all private income. And so in this case, what you're really getting is these are the spillover effects, because you're not getting the straight transfer dollars in there. We get a multiplier that's about 60% of the number that we got up above. Okay, so the multipliers are typically much less than 1, typically 0.4 to 0.6, somewhere in that neighborhood. We also were interested in the issue of consumption. A lot of the modern studies find that when you give out lump sum transfers to people, what happens is it goes into savings rather than into consumption. And so we actually have a measure of retail sales for several years during the 30s. So we look at that. It turns out, on average, retail sales are about 50% of income. The multiplier for retail sales is 75% of the multiplier for income. So you actually seem to be getting a stronger effect on consumption than you would be getting on income. Now, the final thing is what's really interesting, and we're still working out what's going on here. At best, we find no statistically significant positive effect of these spending on private employment. Okay, and this result turns out to be pretty consistent with what you get in a bunch of other studies as well, some that we've done and some that other people have done during this time period. So you seem to be stimulating income with these things, but not private employment. You may be, and to some extent, you might be crowding out private employment. So that's the ultimate results. So you can fight with me about the results now if you like, or you can see what I'm actually doing. So it depends on the seminar. I mean, at Harvard, those 3 slides took me an hour. and so we did discuss a lot or whatever. So, but I could have answered a lot of their questions if they just let me go on a little bit further. All right, so between 1929 and 1932, one of the reasons we wanted to focus on the early 1930s is people don't realize just how much Hoover increased government spending during this period. If you look at the 1920s, what's going on is government spending looks flat per capita in the 1920s across the country. Between 1929 and 1932, Hoover increased nominal government spending by about 52%. When you include about a 30% deflation, in real terms, it goes up by about 88% during this time period. So this is really big. In the fastest 3 years of government spending growth during the Roosevelt administration, which is from 33 to 36, they only go up by 69%. Now they're starting from a higher base, but don't think that Hoover didn't spend a lot of money. The difference between the two is that when Hoover raised government spending, he didn't announce a new program to do it. He just did it in the context of the old programs. So for example, if you look at the highway spending during this time period, what you'll find is there are all sorts of discussions in the highway records and the highway reports about, okay, we sped these projects up, we actually increased spending here. One of the reasons we wanted to do that is unemployment is high, we wanted to hire an extra 100,000 workers. So that's the way they talked about this. Whereas when Roosevelt comes in, what he does is he says, okay, we're going to start a Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Okay, we're going to have all these various changes, so there's a lot more visibility about the changes in spending publicly than there were under the Hoover administration. Okay, so both, and this is the thing that economic historians know, but no one else seems to know, is that both of these guys not only increased spending, but they also increased tax collections. Now, Hoover was always famous for wanting to be a balanced budget guy. And so it turns out, Roosevelt ran on a balanced budget platform, and he pretty much worked to balance the budget throughout most of this time period. So when they spent more, they typically collected more taxes. Now, one of the interesting features, and I didn't really understand this till earlier this year, is that the mix of tax revenues changes dramatically over the course of the 1930s. And so I still haven't figured out all the implications for this. A lot of people focus on the income tax rate increase in 1932. I mean, and this is pretty spectacular. If you're earning more than $1 million, your tax rate went from 23% to 58%. So that's a pretty large jump. And then Roosevelt jacked it up to 67% 2 years later. Okay? Now, if you were earning $5,000, which is the lowest level for a family of four, at a time when most people were earning $1,000, what you did, your income tax rate went from 0.5 to 2. Now, wouldn't you like to have tax rates like that? Now, so that's a huge rise in percentage terms, but really probably not that big a deal. Now, but one of the things that happens after this increase in the tax rate is that income tax revenues fall like about 35% in the next year. Now, some of it's because the economy is still falling apart, but some of it is, kind of other things, hiding income and things like this. As a matter of fact, if you read Amity Schleye's book, The Forgotten Man, there's all this discussion about how they went after the former Treasury Secretary, Mellon, for tax evasion because he gave a bunch of stuff to the National Gallery. Question?
I thought in the 1930s, it's essentially prior to World War II, income tax as a fraction of total federal tax revenue was really quite small.
No, well, it is in the middle of the 30s. In 1929, it was 90%. Combination of income and corporate taxes was 90% of tax revenues. They just don't collect that much in terms of excise taxes. The big change that occurs here is that this 1932 tax rate increase, most of what they collected comes from new taxes, brand new taxes on gasoline, electricity, automobiles, pipelines, and a whole series of other things. Almost anything you can think of that was kind of new got taxed all of a sudden. So in the middle of the 1930s, in 1934, excise taxes suddenly go to 48% of federal revenue. Still as late as 1939, they're like just still about 34%. So, I mean, this is an entirely different tax structure from the US tax structure today and from the US tax structure in the 20s. So, so what's going on here is at the national level, this is not anything remotely like a Keynesian stimulus, okay? E. Cary Brown showed this in 1956. Larry Pepper showed it in 1973. Matter of fact, Keynes said it in the middle of the 1930s. He wrote open letters to Roosevelt saying, look, you're spending more, but it's not enough. You've got to run deficits, okay, for this to really get the effect that you wanted to have. Alva Hansen, major Keynesian in 1941, they never tried Keynesian spending, okay? And I'm going to show you why. Now, what I'm going to identify off of is the substantial variation in net federal spending in the states, because there was enormous variations in how much they spent in the states, okay, and that's what we're going for. Now, just to show you why it's not Keynesian. All right, so what I want you to do, this is not percentages of GNP. What this is actual dollars. All right, what this says is this is the difference between real GNP in 1929 and real GNP in that year. So what happens is real GNP, and this is in 1958 dollars, so it's in real dollars. Real GDP or real GNP in 1929 is $60 billion lower than it was in 1929. In 33, it's $60 billion lower than in 29. So here's the gap that you're trying to close, okay? Here's government spending, okay? So it's tiny relative to the size of the gap. This is a 30% drop. This is like a 4% of GDP, something like that. Now, take out if you take out the taxes or whatever, this is the budget deficit. So this is how big the budget deficit is relative to the size of the problem. So If you're John Maynard Keynes and you think that this is going to work, you need a multiplier of like 30. All right? And so even Keynes never came up with a multiplier of 30. So basically, it's not a Keynesian event. And so finally, even Paul Krugman has said it's not a Keynesian event. I gave a talk about the New Deal in Korea, and they were telling me, I said I was just trying to correct all the record and things like this. You know, high school textbooks say this, and it's just wrong. It's not Keynesian. So the guys in Korea come up to me and said their high school textbooks said there was a Keynesian stimulus. So they thanked me for correcting the record. So we're really going to see if I had an effect in Korea about 5 years from now. Okay, so here's the story. Per capita New Deal grants and tax receipts, just to give you an idea of what was going on at the state level. Okay, so this is per capita total federal taxes. North Carolina gets hit pretty hard. This is tobacco. So the evil, stinking weed. Okay, Nevada makes off like a bandit in terms of huge amounts of spending. Arizona does very well as well. You know, most of these are western states that are doing quite well. So there's a lot of variation in this in both tax collections and also in revenue spending. Okay, so now, it wasn't that they didn't think about multipliers. They just thought about it differently from the way that Keynes did. And so there was a study done in 1935 by the US Bureau of Agricultural Economics, where what they did was they came up with a multiplier for highway spending. All right, and so the basic idea, the way they do this is they say, okay, you start out, you spend $100,000 on highways, 24,000 of that is for labor, and then the rest of it's spent on other things like asphalt and concrete and all sorts of things like this. And so we're going to trace what happens to the asphalt and the concrete until it becomes someone's income. It's paid out as a wage or a salary. Okay, and so they come up with a multiplier for employment of 2.7 and a multiplier of 3 for economic activity based on this. So I'll show you their schematic diagram that they said was a clear description of what was going on. So very entertaining. So this is the $24,000 start. Okay, and then what all the rest of this is detailed descriptions of like this petroleum products and cement and things like this. And the money eventually fans out and becomes payments to somebody eventually. Okay, so you start out with this original payments and then it ends up being 2 or 3 times larger, depending. All right, now, but there's no like economic modeling involved in this or anything like this. It's basically just tracing the money until it's like an accounting exercise. So there's no like behavioral response or anything like this. Okay.
But what's multiplying it out? This is just following the money. How come it's growing?
It's growing because what's happening is that it's going to like asphalt and it gets spent on the asphalt and becomes income for only part of the asphalt. Then it goes to the next sector and becomes income somewhere else. And so there's something funky going on that causes it to grow out there.
I would kind of follow it up. It just should end up unless you get them doing something like the Keynesian thing is kind of...
There's some circular stuff going on as well. Like I said, having read the 65-page document or whatever, the 65 document is no clearer than this graph. I can guarantee you. So, but they made a lot of hay with this. Actually, they had these things. The farmer dollars go to town. And here's what happens as a result and things like that. So, okay, so the multipliers we estimate, the reason we focus on this period, one reason is I've been studying the New Deal for the last 12 years. So that's the primary reason we focus on this period. But another reason to focus on this period is that there's ever a period where there's unused capacity, the 1930s is the one. Okay, we have 25% unemployment in 1933. The unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate never falls below like 10% during the 1930s. Now, there's the big Darby article about whether or not you should treat work relief workers as unemployed. Even if you treat work relief workers as employed, the unemployment rate is over 9.5% the entire decade. So it's a really high unemployment rate. And I would argue that the relief workers, there are different ways of thinking about it. The relief workers are actually producing things. But if you're thinking about it in terms of these people being employed or not, what you really want to think about is if you're on a work relief job, it's really like being on unemployment insurance today, but you have to work to get the money. Okay, because the typical wage, if you could have gotten a job on the Public Works Administration, which was just hired out in the normal way, didn't worry about whether you're you're unemployed or not, you would have gotten, say, $1 per hour. If you ended up on the WPA, you got 50 cents per hour. Okay, and essentially the WPA program was designed to put you back at a minimum standard of living. So it wasn't like they were employing you in a normal sense. Then one of the interesting things about this has been, as soon as all the problems started, you know, CBS Sunday Morning and all these other people kept saying, we need a WPA, we need a 2010 WPA or 2009 WPA. And I keep thinking to myself, if people knew exactly how the WPA operated, there's no way in hell they'd want a 2008 WPA. They like the buildings and stuff, and that's true. Okay, but I don't think you're going to find anybody who's going to get off the unemployment insurance or whatever and demand to work construction for 50 cents on the dollar. I just don't think that's going to happen. And matter of fact, if you're Harold Ickes, who ran the Public Works Administration and who fought with Harry Hopkins to try to get money from Roosevelt to fund his program, Ickes always lost out to Hopkins because Hopkins spent the money much faster. Okay, and so the WPA, the work relief program, got huge amounts of money. The PWA, as you will see, didn't get nearly as much money. And Ickes always thought that this was terrible. And so still today, everybody talks about the WPA as being this wonderful thing, but the program they really want is Ickes' program, which is the PWA. So just think how many times he's revolving in his grave during this time period. The only guy who's stopped him from revolving right now is me. And it's only happening in a few places around America, and around Canada as well. Okay, so here's the current deficit relative to the past. We have an extraordinarily high deficit in the United States now. 10% of GDP in 2009. It's going to be over 10% in 2010, although not as high as we thought it was going to be. This is the largest since the all-out war of World War II. To give you some context, here is kind of all the budget deficits over the time period, and here's where we are in 2009 and 2010. The most Keynesian presidents in American economic history since World War II are Reagan and the first George Bush, who were also always talking about supply-side economics. So anyway, so they were the true Keynesians. Now, so here's how the modern macro literature tries to deal with this, okay? And so what they're trying to do is they're worried about endogeneity, which makes sense, because if you're spending more money to try to stimulate the economy, usually it's because the economy is not doing that well. So everybody spends a lot of time trying to come up with a way to control for endogeneity. So they come up with several clever ways to do it. The one that started out that Barrow used in 1982 in the JPE was he looked at military buildups. And the one he focused on was World War II. Okay, he says World War II was not a response to the Great Depression or anything like that. It was a response to an all-out war. So he estimates the multiplier gets a number of like 0.8. Okay, and then for a long time, hardly anybody does any multiplier estimation. If they do, it's kind of like on the back of the envelope calculations out of things. So, but then what happens is Christy Romer and David Romer start telling these things where they come up with narratives about tax cuts. And they say, okay, we're going to identify a period where we get a tax cut. All right, and in that period, however, this is a period where they have a tax cut, but they're not talking about problems with the economy. I don't know whether that works or not, but this is what they do. They've got a paper coming out in the AER, and they get tax cut multipliers ranging from 1 to 3, depending on how long a time period you look at during this period. The latest stuff that people have been doing in kind of empirical work to try to deal with this, in addition to VARs and all sorts of things like this, is to use defense announcements. And so Valerie Ramey's got a really nice paper. She had an original paper with Matt Shapiro where she used defense announcements. And so they used the announced defense spending, and then they use that as an instrument to try to see what's going on. And then Valerie also develops one where she looks at the defense announcements and then deviations from the defense announcements as unexpected shocks. I'm not sure if that fully works, because you might deviate from the announcement because the economy's falling apart or it's getting better. So that could be a reason why you deviate. So who knows? But anyway, so what's happened here is, here are the various ranges of multipliers you get. Mark Zandi at Moody's came in about 1.5. He's got kind of the old Lawrence Klein style model, kind of like the old DRI and all those kind of people thing. Okay, now he and Blinder just have a paper that they just put out, kind of a public paper that they put on the internet, and they argue that, well, here's how we do it, but they don't really deal with endogeneity very well at all in this story. Now, in some sense or whatever, the endogeneity would be negative, and so maybe this is a small estimate of what they would get. But we don't really know exactly how the model is estimated because this is all, he's selling the forecasts and stuff, so he doesn't want to reveal everything about what's going on. So Romer and Romer, this was a working paper starting in 2006. It's now coming out. Romer and Bernstein really built off of Zandy, but then backed away because they didn't really think much about Zandy's model. So Barrow gets 0.8. Barrow and Redlich, using the Ramey Defense News multiplier, come up with a number of about 0.6 to 0.8. Kogan, Swick, Taylor, and Weiland come up with numbers about 1, or much less than 1, actually. So a lot of these people are getting crowding out. Now, Robert Barrow, I spent a lot of time talking to him about this, and he's got a thing where he spends a lot of time talking about World War II. Now, I would argue that World War II is not a good spot to look for a multiplier for the modern United States. All right, and the reason is that we were fighting an all-out war. The military, we produced almost 40% of GDP was military goods that were tanks and things like that were going to blow up. So it's not normal production. The military is making almost all the allocation decisions for almost anything related to the war effort. The civilians really don't have much control of this at all. And so we have huge wage and price controls and a tremendous amount of rationing going on at the time. I would argue that the multiplier for World War II is a better picture of what was going on in the Soviet Union during the Cold War than it is on what's happening in the United States today. So it's not that Barrow's not getting a good number, it's just he's getting a number for a different style economy than what we usually think about. Now, in his defense on this, when he uses the multiplier and he actually estimates without World War II, he gets smaller multipliers without World War II than he does with World War II. So in some sense, the World War II multiplier is the biggest one that Barrow finds for the kind of stuff that he's doing. Now, other people have come up with measures. Blanchard and Perotti did a structural VAR on quarterly data. I already mentioned Ramey and Shapiro. Now, there's been some Great Depression multipliers. Christina Romer had this famous paper in 1992 about where she argues that monetary policy was the primary driver. And so what she does in that is that she looks at 2 periods where she says that they were not responding to economic differences. And then she kind of does a 2 equations and 2 unknowns calculation of what was going on. And she gets a number of 0.23 for the fiscal multiplier and 0.8 for the money multiplier. So she says monetary policy was the big factor there. Now, Galty-Egerton's got a paper that came out in the AER in 2008. And so he argues, based on the old Wigmore and Temin paper from 1990, that fiscal policy made an important difference during this period because it was one of 4 pieces of a major package that was a shock to the American macro policy. So the argument there is that before that time, you had huge problems with deflationary expectations that were driving all sorts of bad things in the economy. And so what you needed to do was you had to shock the economy to get you to move out of the system. Okay, and the way you shocked it was you went off the gold standard. You needed inflationary expectations. You have to go off the gold standard. You increase the money supply, reduce interest rates. You announce that you're going to raise commodity prices. You pass the National Recovery Administration to try to drive prices and wages further up. And also you increase fiscal policy and fiscal spending to try to make it credible that you're going to increase the money supply. Now notice he's not really emphasizing fiscal spending. It's just one of 5 things that are important in this. So he argues for this. And the way this works is you have to have very low interest rates to have this work. Okay, so those are the Great Depression multipliers.
Does it even make sense to think of that as a multiplier?
No, I don't think so. This is just a stimulus. But I wanted to mention it because people have pointed it out to me and I wanted to make sure we covered it. Alumnia, Benetrix, Eichengreen, O'Rourke, and Rua did this 27-country study. I can't remember where it's coming out now. They looked at fiscal and monetary policy with a panel VAR, and they actually found a very strong fiscal stimulus of like 2.5 on impact and 1.2 after 1 year. They have to make some assumptions about endogeneity that I think have some problems with them and things like that, but this was their effort to this. And basically said most of the countries did not stimulate. When they focused on the fiscal stimulus, they focused on defense spending. But defense spending in a lot of these cases or whatever could be responses to what's going on in the economy as well. You certainly see that in the United States during this time period. And then there's some more. So now we get to where I'm really doing, which is regional multipliers, but not very many people actually estimate regional multipliers anymore. They used to estimate them more. State and local forecasters do. Most of the time you see these things done when they're trying to build stadiums or introduce the Olympics or do things like that. And so So I don't know what your experience with these multipliers are, but here's my experience with these multipliers. In Tucson, the Tucson Symphony actually asked the business school to come up with an estimate of the multiplier for the Tucson Symphony. And I love the Tucson Symphony. So we went and they had this as an MBA project for executive MBAs. So the executive MBAs went out and surveyed what everybody was doing in terms of multipliers for the arts. And they came up with a number that we could back out of 1.5. So we used that multiplier. We took the whole budget for the symphony, multiplied by 1.5, sent it off. And they called us back and said, this is way too low. And we said, well, but this, frankly, in my view or whatever, the multiplier is like 0.5. But I didn't want to say that. And so I said, well, why do you say it's too low? He said, well, the stadium people are saying it's 4. And they also had that so the baseball stadium people, now the baseball stadium people at least had a point in that they were actually attracting people who are getting into hotel rooms and things like that. Whereas the symphony attract people from 30 miles away, and that's about it. But then there's the World Golf Classic, which is played in Tucson now in every March. It's a big match play thing. If you back out what they claim their effect of the economy is, their multiplier must be 25. And so you're sitting there going, well, so most multipliers for sports multipliers turn out to be like close to 0. At least Roger Knoll at Stanford says that that's the case. And they usually provide such great jobs as selling peanuts at the ballpark and beer and things like this. And they may attract a high-paid athlete or whatever, but chances are the athlete doesn't live in Tucson. They live in Las Vegas, where they can spend their money and do all sorts of funny things. Okay, now regional economists do this. Almost all of them have done it with OLS estimation. So they really don't spend a lot of time paying a lot of attention to the endogeneity issues associated with this. There are various multiplier stories in the regional literature. I've done one with an old-style Keynesian model. Yes?
So these regional economists, they get really low numbers?
No, they get pretty high numbers.
I would think that the endogeneity would usually go kind of the other way.
You'd think, but they get pretty high numbers. I don't know. I agree with you. Matter of fact, it's kind of stunning. When you get a number like 3, I just couldn't think, how did they get that?
Especially, it's kind of hard to give the endogeneity that would give that.
So, but one of the things, too, is that most of this literature was done before everybody spent a lot of time with panels and fixed effects and things like that. So they're not taking out fixed effects. They're not taking out all sorts. It's really just kind of a really levels against levels raw number. Okay, now most of the work that's been doing that in the regional literature has been more theoretical work about how you can get a multiplier without a Keynesian story. And so there's been an economic base and neoclassical economic base multipliers. The way that they get this story is that you don't have a Keynesian thing that's blocking things. What you have instead is you have an upper sloping labor supply curve in the area. And what happens is you stimulate aggregate demand or demand for labor in the area, it moves you up the labor supply curve. And so you end up with higher wages and more employment. And so that's where they get their multiplier effect, is through that. Okay, now some of the things what they do is also in the literature on people who are forecasters and stuff, a lot of times they have these I/O matrices or whatever that they've developed. And so you can look if you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis discussions of input-output matrices, they have all these things for how much you spend on each of these pieces. It reminds me a lot of what the old USDA thing was. And then there's a state study by Blanchard and Katz that was more dynamic in nature. Okay, so we have some New Deal results that are not really multipliers, but are pertinent to what's going on. So Fishback, along with, that's me, with Horace and Cantor, we had some papers on retail sales growth. Over where what we were looking at, we know how much they spent over the entire period on the New Deal between 1933 and 39. We look at the growth rate for retail sales and try to see whether there's a positive effect or not. And what we find is there's a positive effect of public works and relief spending, but there's a slight negative effect of farm spending. And this farm spending thing turns out to be very important. Because one of the key features about the farm spending was this is the origins of the farm programs in America. So these are the programs where they started paying farmers not to produce. So there's a natural crowding out that comes out. So you really need to treat those dollars differently. So we find that that's really important to do. We find similar results when we look at net migration as well. Garrett and Wheelock do a similar thing during this period, and they find similar results, but they look at the state level. Neither of them worried about taxes very much at the time. Then there's a bunch of stuff about employment crowding out. And so Fleck did a paper about this. Wallace and Benjamin wrote 2 papers. Benjamin Matthews wrote a paper. And then there's Newman, Fishback, and Cantor, which just came out in the JEH. Basically, if you use a cross-sectional study, you found no effect. If you did a panel study or whatever, you found more effects. Benjamin and Matthews find like small crowding out effects in the early 1930s, and then they find bigger crowding out effects in the late 1930s. Newman, Fishback, and Cantor, what they found is in the early 1930s, you get a positive stimulus during the periods of the highest unemployment, not a very big one, but a positive one, and then you start getting substantial crowding out in the later part of the 1930s. Okay, so.
Quick question.
Yes.
I might want to defer this, but so when we talk about crowding out, if the states say cut their spending, is that part of the crowd out? Or
that could be part of the crowd out in this context.
In this context, but if I'm thinking about the effect of government spending more generally, you want to
this is
count that as crowd out.
This is federal spending coming in, okay, and they're going to have rules with how they interact with the states, although they ignore the rules almost routinely. We would like to have actually controlled for the states. Here's the problem, is that the federal government put together, and matter of fact, continues to put together consistent estimates of state spending, same categories and everything like that. And they did that all the way up to 1932, and then they started again in 1937. So there's a 5-year hole that we're in the middle of trying to fill. And so John Wallace has filled the hole for 16 states. I went to the Wallace archive in his basement in College Park, Maryland, and picked up 16 more states of just the Xeroxes, and then went and took photographs of 16 more states. And so I have students right now who are trying to put together these numbers to be consistent. And you just cannot believe. I pitied the people who actually put those numbers together for the federal government because oh boy, the state financial statistics are really something to see. Okay, so let's talk about what the dependent variable is going to be here. Okay, so the first thing is, what most people don't realize when they look at the state numbers that they see is the state numbers prior to 1990 are all state personal income. Now, the way that you get personal income, the idea is to capture purchasing power. And so what they do is, in the course of doing this, is they subtract out business savings. They also subtract out payroll taxes, because they're arguing that these are not available for people to spend. So now payroll taxes don't play a big role till the late 30s in this. Okay, then they add in transfer payments. So for example, federal pensions to veterans get treated as income in this. So do, I'll come back to that, government retirement payments, unemployment benefits, old age insurance, benefit payments, any kind of welfare payments get treated as part of this. So this is not your normal GDP at the state level. This is personal income at the state level. Okay, now, the other thing that's really interesting in this is how they deal with the veterans bonuses during this period. So the veterans bonus from World War I was introduced in 1924. And the way it worked is that if you were in service in World War I, they would pay you based on the amount of service, but they would wait till 1945 to make a payout to you. Okay? So basically what it was like a retirement bonus when you hit retirement age for people who lived who fought in World War I. So I see this as being a good thing because, I mean, World War I, they introduced the draft. They don't pay the soldiers very well. They stick them in foxholes, do all these terrible things to them. But this was clearly designed to be a delayed payment that wouldn't come until 20 years after you got the adjusted service certificate. So that's what they called it, an adjusted service certificate. Now, it turns out these things are pretty complicated. The famous thing that everybody knows about is the Veterans Bonus of 1936. In the Veterans Bonus of 1936, they agreed to pay out these things in cash in 1936, about 9 years early. Okay, what they don't tell you about, and so that dollar, those payouts are in this as being personal income. Okay, what they don't tell you about is when the veterans are marching on Washington back in 1932, the veterans are marching on Washington and they're asking for the veterans bonus at that point, and there's this famous thing where they're camping on the Potomac River, and they send out the army to try to keep things calm, and the army doesn't keep things calm. Instead, they run riding roughshod through the training camps, and they kill some veterans and do things like this. So it's just a terrible thing for the Hoover administration. But the veterans had the opportunity to borrow money against these adjusted service certificates from the Veterans Bureau. And so they could borrow up to half the amount of the certificate, and they could borrow it at like 3% interest. So before the Veterans March, in 1931, the Veterans Bureau lent out like $800 million to the various veterans during this time period. So when the veterans marched on Washington, what they were really doing is saying, look, the loan's not enough, we want the money now. And we want it in cash, and we don't have to wait another 9 years. So it would be like me and John Wallace and a few other people going and camping on the Potomac River now and asking for our Social Security payments now, rather than waiting until we're at retirement age, in a sense. So I'm going to write a paper about this eventually called the Veterans Bonus. It's really a matter of interest. And I'm going to use it to teach present value to all sorts of students in the future. So essentially though, this is all included, including the loans are treated as income in these state personal income measures because the loans they're claiming are an unusual source of purchasing power that they wouldn't have normally anticipated. So that makes things a little bit more messy. Okay, so that means when $1 of transfer payments comes in, it's going to be $1 almost immediately in someone's income in this. So in some ways, that's going to elevate the multiplier somewhat. Now, one of the things we're doing is, and as I said, we're in the process of actually trying to put these back, put the income payments back. I managed to find the data to do that. Okay, and Valentina and I did. And then we also have figured out a way to take out the transfer payments so we can actually look at something that's more production-based than with the transfer payments. And like I said, I thought I was done with that. I thought I'd have some results for you, but there was an error in something, and so I had to fix that on the plane. Okay, so there's also problems with measurement error, because how would they know how much this money is? All right, so how do they collect the information? So you know the entrepreneurial income just is not that good. The only entrepreneurial income they're going to have is for income tax returns. In the income tax returns, people are only paying, only about 5% of the population are paying income taxes. So there's just not enough entrepreneurs in there who are being covered. And they have to do a lot of interpolation in this. So we look at the component measures of this as well. So one of the components is per capita wage and salary income. Now this is not perfect because the salary income is not super, but it does allow us to take out the transfers. And a lot of the wage income is actually pretty good numbers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics by this time has their establishment surveys that they still have today. And so we actually have monthly information in each state about what they're paying out under the establishment survey. Okay, another thing that's going on is, and so that's what this payroll data, we also have a manufacturing census every odd year during this time period. And so we're able to look at the odd years where we're at least look at the manufacturing payrolls during that time period and employment. And these are universal censuses, so these are about the best data you're going to get on an annual basis. Retail sales is also from a universal census of the retail sector, and we have that for 4 years. Auto registrations per capita, we're going to use that as a measure of durable good consumption. And so we actually have that. That's pretty good because the states are collecting taxes, and they're usually pretty good at finding out whether people have automobiles or not. It's not that easy to hide one during this time period. We're also going to have employment in broad areas and employment manufacturing. So if you've got a thing you'd like to have us look at, we'll try to look at. We've got more coming. The postal savings receipts are the primary way that the poor saved during this period. And so we discovered recently we have all that information as well. So we just got to put it together. Okay, so I already talked about that. Now, the government spending measure turns out to be kind of tricky as well. Okay, there are several types of government spending we're going to talk about. Non-repayable grants is one. Okay, so that's usually what you typically think about as being spending. Then there are loans. Okay, we need to talk about loans because some kinds of loans are different from other kinds of loans. And then there's the veterans bonus. So here's how the non-repayable grants shake out. About 62% of all the money that they spent in grants was for relief programs. Between 1933 and 1935, about half of the relief money is direct relief. Okay, it's direct payments to people with no work requirement. Okay, so this is true transfer payments. Okay, between 33 and 35, about half the money is work relief, where there actually is some kind of purchase of actual goods in the process, in a sense, because they're producing things. Okay, after 1935 or whatever, there's some public assistance matching grants. These are old age assistance and aid to dependent children and things like this. But they're small. They're relatively small. The primary thing that's going on is work relief from the Work Project Administration. Okay, because basically what happens is the federal government stops giving direct relief to almost anybody. They don't let the state and local governments take over that function back in 1935. Now, the Public Works Administration, the Public Roads Administration, the Public Buildings Administration, these were all things that were in place before the New Deal. Okay, these continue on, and these are the ones that were basically hiring people as if they were just normally in labor markets. So the Public Works Administration, for example, is Harold Ickes out there hiring people for full wages, and he's the one who's saying that it's my program you should be imitating, not Harry Hopkins' program. Okay, so they account for about 20% of the grants. This is also the Army Corps of Engineers as well, so in those kind of situations. Now, there's one type of grant in here that the Office of Government Reports treated as grants that are actually loans, and those are grants under the Reclamation Bureau. The Bureau of Reclamation built irrigation projects, mostly out west. They built them with non-interest loans, but the non-interest loans, they waited to repay the loans until after the project was finished, and a lot of times they forgave it even after that. So the Office of Government Reports treats those as grants, and we're going to treat them as grants as well. Okay, so then there's the AAA farm grants. I described these to you before. What they do is they pay landowners to take land out of production. They remove the land from production, and this cuts the demand for labor. Okay, and so it's likely that this payment actually helped elites, large landowners, because mostly large landowners got it, at the expense of sharecroppers and wage workers. Okay, and so we've been trying to identify this. All the evidence seems to suggest this indirectly, because we found that retail sales dropped in these areas, so that the farmers may have increased their spending, but the poor did not, and actually may have fallen. And we also have estimates of migration that suggest that there's out-migration in areas where they spend the AAA money. And so we're in the middle of collecting the wages to be able to look directly at what happens to farm wages. So this is a substantially different thing. You really need to separate this out. Then there are the loans. Okay, so here's the problem with the loans. We already talked about the Reclamation Bureau. Those are pretty easy. But how do you deal with something like a homeowners loan corporation loan? So here's what the homeowners loan corporation did. In 1933, what the homeowners loan corporation did, they started doing was they bought 1 million mortgages from lenders and then turned around and refinanced all these mortgages at really good interest rates and much better loan terms. So if the typical mortgage during this time period on a good mortgage was a 6 or 7% interest rate, the mortgage rate on the HOLC loans was 5%. Now, but these were loans, every one of these loans was a bad loan at the time it was refinanced. And so there's no way, no one was going to touch these things. Okay, so what's the subsidy in that? Okay, is it the whole value of the loan? Is it part of the value of the loan? And so what we do is we tried several different ways of measuring the loans. We give it a 10% subsidy, or we take the full value of the loan. So we're going to give you a lot of different ways to look at it. So you can decide which of these you want to choose. And you can look at the linear combinations to decide. Okay, so we talked about the World War I adjusted service certificates. So basically what you get is the loans are in there as part of the loans. It turns out when they give them the veterans bonus in 1936, only about $1.7 billion goes out in cash. The other $1.6 billion is paying off all the loans that these guys previously had on the loans. Okay. Now, so there's dealing with taxation. So as you can see, things keep getting more complicated. Now, I have a feeling that all these things are things to worry about today, too, but you just don't hear people talk about it. Okay, so now we're going to deal with taxation. Now, one of the things about this is the federal tax system, it's all the same rate across the country. So just using year fixed effects actually controls for the tax rate differences across time. And remember, you know, the excise tax rates or whatever are the ones that are really driving a lot of what's going on during this time period. Now, but there may be differential effects on the economy based on the structure. For example, North Carolina gets hit by a lot of taxes because they produce tobacco. Okay, Detroit's getting hit by a lot of taxes because they produce automobiles. All right, so to take that into account, we also do estimates where we have net spending after you take out the federal taxes in this situation. And then the final one is the time frame. So the time frame, it turns out that all the federal data is reported on a fiscal year basis from July 1st, year T-1, to June 30th in year T. So basically, using it on the fiscal year basis, you're assuming automatically a 6-month lag in this process. Now, how serious an issue is this? I don't know. When Newman, Fishback, and Cantor did this, they have these like 3-year windows where they look at the response functions. Most of the effects start actually happening. There's some effects in the first 6 months, but most of them really hit in the period from 6 months to 12 months. So that's some info about this. To some extent, however, we're going to be picked, to the extent that there's serial correlation in what's going on with the federal spending, we're going to pick up these effects anyway, just because whatever the first 6 months we're leaving out are going to be highly correlated with the second 6 months that's in there. Okay, now we are actually in the process of doing all this other stuff. For some of these programs, we can actually put them on a calendar year basis. We just can't do it for all of them. Okay, so I just about finished being ready to do it to where we can compare calendar year to fiscal year on those programs and just to see what's going on. Okay, so here's the expectations of the multiplier, and then I can stop putting you to sleep and actually show you where the rubber hits the road. Okay, so the multiplier expectations at the local level. Here's what you're going to expect. If there are more unemployed resources to soak up, you're going to expect the multiplier to be bigger. Okay, to the extent that the things that they produce and they build are complementary to existing production and make people more productive, then that's actually going to stimulate, that's going to lead to more spillover benefits as well. So for example, roads might give you more opportunity to be connected to outside markets, so that could actually stimulate production in the local area. It actually could harm production to the extent that you're bringing in imports to some extent. A better example for stimulating these things would be like sanitation improvements that make people healthier, that make them more productive, and so therefore stimulate the output in the economy. Now, it's like a small country multiplier and things like this. The more leakages you have, the more the money is spent on tradable goods that come from outside, the smaller the multiplier is going to be. And at some point, we're going to try to adjust for this with the spatial analysis. Let's see, I already said this. And then it's going to be weakened to the extent that it crowds out private activity or local activity. And it could be state and local activity. Now, one feature about this is, in terms of the state and local, when we were originally doing this with the retail sales, one of the things we were looking at was most of these states and local governments have balanced budget requirements. Now, they don't necessarily meet them in the early 30s. Most of them run deficits in the early 30s. But they don't run very large deficits. And so once you start looking at these things with these balanced budget features, most of the effects get really small pretty quickly. It becomes a second order effect. And so I'm not as worried about not having that in there because of that. Okay, so the good thing about this, there's not huge amounts of data necessarily. It's 11 years and there's 48 states and stuff, so you can see all the data if you want. All right, so here's this is level against level. So this is every observation in the thing. Okay, so this is the per capita levels of grants in every year, and this is the real per capita state income. All right, so you can see Nevada does very well in all these various years. And then you see a whole clump of people. And so there's a lot of people in the early years of the 30s who look like this. Now, but we're going to do this in a fixed effects estimation. So in other words, what's really going to matter is the time variation in this. So I'm going to show it to you in differences. And so this is all the data in differences, first differences. So this is the differences in grants. This is differences in per capita state income. Okay? This section in here is pretty much the 1930s, or early like 30 to 32, or 30 to 31, 32. Okay? And then what you see is it tends to spread out more as you get into the into the 30s. And so just to give you a better idea so you can actually see this a little bit easier. So this is the New England states. As you can see, there's a pretty, like here's Connecticut, and Connecticut kind of rolls around like this. And so you can kind of see these things. And so almost everybody kind of it almost looks like one of those bouquets or something like this. So the original one, this is a much better bouquet or whatever. This is what you send to a Nobel Prize winner or whatever. This is what you send to Price after he finishes the seminar today. So pretty sparse in this kind of area or whatever. So the roses have all fallen off the bloom and all sorts of things in this one. Okay. So this is a pretty common picture. Now here is the mid-Atlantic states. These are some of the biggest economies in the country. And so you can see it's almost straight up and down in terms of these relationships here. So Delaware goes up and down. Delaware is a pretty rich state, it turns out. Okay, and so this is the east, north, central. This is Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, and it also has these same kind of relationships here. And so one of the things I'm going to do, I can't do everything that we've done with the panel, But we are going to estimate state by state what these multipliers look like under some assumptions. So you can see what the various state multipliers look like. So this is the West, North, Central. So these are the lovely areas like North Dakota, which is the only state I've not yet visited. Okay, and South Dakota and Kansas and those kind of areas.
So in these, in these graphs, you're not taking out like just a general time effect first, or?
No, I haven't taken any time effects out. This is just the change. So this is giving you the change across time. So I have not taken out the aggregate shock or anything like that. Okay, so this is what the South looks like or whatever. It's a smaller bouquet. This is Florida. You can see it in here. This is the kind of the lower South. This is Texas and South Carolina. Actually, the amazing thing is South Carolina fares very well during the Great Depression. They are the only state that sees, if you compare their 1929 retail sales per capita to 39, their retail sales per capita in 39 are like 20% higher than they were in 29. Almost everybody else is at the same level or a little bit lower. And so apparently they have a manufacturing boom in South Carolina. How they can do that, I have no idea. And so I still haven't worked that out. So here's Maryland and Kentucky and Tennessee and these kind of places. Now where things really get, where you get much more variation is in the West. And so this is the mountain states. Okay, and here are the Pacific states. And so you can see your nearest neighbor, Washington. So Mauricio was showing me pictures of the border discontinuities between Washington and Vancouver in terms of settlement during this period. So here's the empirical report approach. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the level of income as a function of government spending or government spending minus taxes. We're going to include state fixed effects to control for time invariant features of the states, year fixed effects to take out the aggregate, the annual changes, like money supply shocks and things like this. I had a discussion with someone wherever they were talking a little bit about Fed policy, and Fed policy varied by region. I mean, that is, actually, I thought about that more. Fed policy varied by region between 30 and 32, but not really thereafter. And so, and even that, the major changes were like Atlanta versus St. Louis. And I mean, there's some variations in the other ones, but I don't think they're big enough to really drive most of what's going on. And this is state-specific time trends. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do, like I said, what's going to happen is we're going to get relatively small effects until we instrument because of negative endogeneity bias. So here's the instrument that we're going to try. Okay, so the basic idea is the following. It's an interaction term. It's a hybrid instrument in a sense. If you look at all the geographical studies of the distribution across states during this time period, and you can appreciate this, okay, what you find is the dominant thing that seems to show up in every single study is that states that are more swing voting states tend to get more money. Okay, and this shows up, we wrote the paper, but I mean, there must be 20 papers in this literature. Every one of them, almost every one of them finds that swing voting is the dominant thing. So what we're going to use, our measure of swing voting is going to be the standard deviation of the percent voting for Democrats for president between 1896 and whatever the most recent election is. But we're not going to use, like, it's going to be the previous year. So for example, if we're talking about the year 1928, it's only going to update to 1924, okay? So during the period of the 30s, it's going to update twice. So after the 32 election, what's going to happen is the 33, 34, 35, and 36 measures will include the 1932 election information. Okay, and so 1936 does not include the 1936 election. In 37, we'll add in the 1936 election.
Does that make a big difference since you're going back, kind of to 1896?
It can make it. So, given that there's some big swings during this time period, I mean, it could have an effect. But we wanted it to update because we wanted some time variation during this period.
That's what I wanted to know. At the flip side, is how much you're getting off the time variation. So, I mean, I don't mind knowing it, but at the same time, you'd almost want to know what you're getting without the time variation.
Right, and so one of the things I haven't had a chance to do, I wanted to do this thing where we actually use just those time periods around the elections just to see what happens. So kind of like here's a period and then here's another period. So I just haven't had a chance. I've been on the road too much and I haven't been able to do it. And I keep having to fix data that I didn't think I had to fix something. And so the reason for the instrument is to try to say, okay, look, this is interacted with a trend in national spending, or an equivalent of a trend in national spending. So the idea here is if the whole country is spending more money, you're going to get more money. Okay, and then what's going to happen is you're going to get an additional bang if you have more swing voting, and if the amount of swing voting went up. So if you become more of a swing state, you'll get an additional bang after that period. So it's not like that, the thing goes from zero, is going 0, 0, 0, and then changing. It's whatever the national number is, and then you get an extra bang from the national number.
And why are some places swing states? Like, I mean, what if you're a swing state because things are going badly, and so you're sort of, people start hunting across parties to see who can fix it up?
So I would argue that most of that would be occurring in the mean, in the amount, the mean that you have. So it might change the standard deviation, but the mean is going to be the driving force there. So you would go Republican or Democrat or whatever, but it wouldn't necessarily make you a swing voting in that kind of process.
So, standard deviation, if I'm a state that goes, say, because all that matters for presidents is if you win. So we're going to
Right.
all electoral. So if I'm, say, going from 100% to the Democrat to 70% to the Democrat, that could look like a really big standard deviation.
That's right.
percent Democrat, but I'm not a swing state in the sense that I'm never at risk.
Right. And so the original paper that started doing these kind of things was Gavin Wright's, and he had what he called a political productivity index. Okay, and so he actually identified what that spot is. Now, it turns out that the political productivity index doesn't seem to work nearly as well as the standard deviation for the vote. And as a matter of fact, in almost all the studies or whatever, standard deviation of the vote always shows up where the political productivity index doesn't always show up. Now, another feature of this, too, is that if it's a 51% vote, okay, then that's good. But a lot of times, wherever, if you start thinking about this in public choice terms, you don't want to just win by 1%. You want to win a mandate to do what you want to do. And so in that case, then the size of the swing would make a difference. And so those are the two things that I think would change that. I think too many people spend up too much time focusing on that 50% rule, because there seems like there's plenty of evidence or whatever that people go for big time swings. Particularly Roosevelt was going for one in 36 and in 32.
So were there only two parties, or were there populist parties?
There are some small parties in there. Matter of fact, the populists, not the populists, it's the progressives in 1912 come in. And so they kind of do this or whatever, but the progressives, a lot of that is splitting out what's going on with the Republicans and splitting out the Republican vote during that time period. So that's why we use the percent voting Democrat in this. Now, so the progressives do screw things up to some extent because, almost everybody's a progressive in one form or another during the 19-teens. So on some issues, the Democrats are progressives. On some issues, the Republicans are progressives, and they go back and forth in these things. But that's why we focused on the Democrats, because they were much less affected than the Republicans.
So again, just to push on this aspect of the time variation in that measure. I'm happy with the measure reform. I'm always still worried about this time variation. Exactly for, you kind of know when things are going bad, incumbents are in bad position.
Sure.
Okay, and so here, when you're using this as kind of over time and getting the time variation, it could be that a big swing is just a reflection of really doing badly.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying.
There, as opposed to anything that was like pre-third, like if you're taking 30 years before, then I kind of say, okay, that has nothing to do. That's you're just swinging something in the system. These are open-minded, whatever they kind of, or they like to look around.
Right. So I understand what you're saying, and that's true. Now, the one thing that's in defense of this, or whatever, is it's updating with a year's lag. So unless you're worried about serial correlation, we are taking out a lot of that with the year fixed effects and things like that. So I see the point that you're making, and I think it makes some sense, but I think that the other controls are actually controlling for a lot of what's going on there. So this variable is interacted with this national trend. So I need to talk. That's fine.
I've been happy to just interact with one that isn't kind of changing over.
Right. And so, but I need to describe the national trend for a moment too. Okay. So the national trend story is the following. We didn't want to include information from that state in the national trend because we were worried about correlation with the error. And we also did not want to include areas right around that state because there may be interactions between the states. So what we did was, say it's Washington. What we did is that when we're using the quote national number, we want a number for an area that's well outside the region where the state is located. And so what we did was we take Washington, we take out the region that Washington's in, which is the Pacific region. We also take out the mountain region, which is right next to that. And we take out a big chunk of the West North Central and the West South Central, so that what's moving this is stuff that's just on the Mississippi River border and everything east of that. So for Massachusetts, for example, we take out, when we're looking at this trend, we take out New England and all the states and most of the eastern states of the country. And so just to try to avoid this thing. So we're just trying to avoid any possibility that there's correlation between the error in the national trend, the quote national trend, and the state that we're talking about. So that's what we do there.
You might want to re-talk about this after, but I don't think you need to worry about that. But
Okay.
anyways,
Well,
that's the kind of stuff we've kind of.
Yeah, no, I've been in that. Yeah, no, I know. So we were trying to do it. We actually wanted to get at least some variation. We wanted some cross-sectional variation here too.
Oh, you do want it. Okay, that's
Yeah,
a different thing.
well,
I thought you really wanted this kind of just use that national part, but like, given it's kind of in the cross-section, it's exactly just a constant. Then you.
Right, and so one of the reasons we wanted to do it is that we didn't want this to be, when we try things where we have state-specific time trends, if it's just the cross-section multiplied by this thing, where we're actually state-specific time trends might actually wipe it all out. Okay, and so it turns out, but we're not going to focus very much on the state-specific time trends, because it turns out even with the instrument we have, it takes too much out. Okay, so we talked about the uncorrelation and things like that. So for the AAA, we actually developed a different version of the hybrid. In this case, what we did is the following. The AAA, the way that they determined how to pass out the money was that they did it in terms of how much they produced in the state in the 5 years before. Okay, so what we did was we took 1928 and we said, okay, here's what that state's share of what are eventually going to be AAA crops. This is that state's share of that, okay? And then we use that as the thing we're going to multiply by the national trends that we were talking about before. So basically we're looking at something that's how they actually distributed it, but we use a period before the start of this period. And then we move it with the national movements. So that's what happens with that. Okay, so what happens with this is, so here are the results with that instrument. So we've got 15 minutes, and so I'm sorry for the delay. Okay, so here's what happens without the instruments. This is with no correlates, just to show the raw correlation. So we get a relationship of 1. Okay, then we add the weather correlates, and it turns out that the weather stuff, or wherever, seems to be pretty strongly correlated with some of this stuff. Okay, and so add this in, or wherever, and you get a pretty strong effect here. Add the state and year fixed effects, and it drops below 1, halfway below 1. And then add the state-specific time trends, you're down to 0.16. But I would argue that basically we're in a position where there's pretty strong negative endogeneity bias even after you do all these controls. Because it's very clear that even though there's a lot of politics that they're playing with the money, they also do, with a lot of these programs, do what they say they're going to do, at least to some degree. And so they actually do spend more money where things are falling apart more. Okay, now as you go across, this includes all the grants and loans, and what you find is the numbers get smaller when you include the loans. When you include 10%, it's just basically in between these two, but it's not a linear combination. This is the grants minus taxes, and the thing is taxes are really highly correlated with income, and that's what's driving this negative number. So they start out at minus 0.87, and it ends up you're getting closer to 0 at this point. And this is when you split out the AAA, and so this one goes wild. I'm not sure where this comes from. And so you get down to here or whatever, and you're still getting pretty strong effects, or you're just not getting big effects here. Okay, so the instruments, this is what the picture looks like if you just do the instruments against the variable we're instrumenting for, so it's a pretty strong positive correlation. Once you do all the tests or whatever for doing this, the Stock and Yogo style tests that they developed for this, we have pretty strong instruments in this. So the instruments, these are the ones we're going to focus on. It turns out that the instrument strength weakens quite a bit when you add the state-specific time trends. So we're going to go ahead and focus on these, and these are all numbers that are the 23, 25, 27. The critical value for not having weak instrument bias at the 10% level is like 16. So these pretty well beat those. If you have 2 instruments you're dealing with, the critical value is about 7, and so we beat that here as well. So these seem to have strength, and the big question is always whether or not you believe they're uncorrelated with the error. So, okay, so we did that. And so you know, the biggest problem with the state-specific time trends is it seems to wipe out the instrument. And so I mean, it's one of other, you know, you're just kind of split in between it. So here are the IV results. And so with no instrument, with no state fixed effects wherever, you get 2.6. Here's what happens when you include the state and year fixed effects. You know, you start, drops down to 0.97, but this is a weak, you've got much more weak instrument bias here. All right, so these are the ones we're going to focus on. So this is the kind of number before you take out the AAA. When you take the AAA out of this or whatever, what you find is AAA has a negative effect, although it's not statistically significant, and you get a much stronger effect of the public works and relief, which are the dominant things that are going on here. So this is 1.67. And as you can see, if you include the loans, that number is going to fall. And if you take out the taxes, the number is going to be smaller as well. Okay, so we just talked about the dollar for dollar. Now, if you look, so we start out with a table that looked like that, okay? If you look throughout, no matter what study we do, no matter what variable you use, all these patterns show up in the same way. If you do the non-IV, you add the weather, the multiplier goes up. If you add state and year fixed effects, the multiplier falls. If you add state time trends, it falls still more. Switch to IV, and every one of these numbers gets more positive than it was before. Okay, and we talked about the state and year fixed effects here. So switch to other measures. Now we're talking about wage and salary income. Now we've taken the transfer payments out. Okay, now the transfer payments are still on the right-hand side. They're just not on the left-hand side. Okay, so we take out the transfer payments, and really what we're getting now is here's the effect that's a spillover effect on the rest of the economy. It's not, so you're not getting the direct transfer in there, you're just getting the spillover effect. And so what you get is, this was the number for state income. This is the number for wage and salary income. To put it in a kind of a context, wage and salary income is about 60% or 62% of income. Okay, so if the multiplier was staying on the same basis, you'd expect to be about 62%. But it tends to be much smaller. It tends to be about 47%. So these numbers are much, much smaller. The only one that seems to be in the same range is the non-AAA grants. And what you get here is you get a much stronger negative effect of the non-AAA grants in this than you did before. One of the key reasons for this is the overall personal income is including the income for all the farmers who are farm owners, who are the ones that are getting the transfer from the AAA. And so this is including only the farm workers in this. And so it's really important, I think, for us to look specifically at farm wages, just to see what's going on. Okay? And as you can see, the grants minus taxes are much smaller in these kind of things. So, okay, so this is the per capita.
Just to make sure, just the previous
Sure.
slide, just because I think that's kind of key. So again, if we're just looking at this non-AAA, and you are getting this the consistent picture of this. This wasn't the one.
This is not the one?
No, this is.
Oh, this is, oh, sorry,
Yeah,
hang on, we go back. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so we're kind of getting this picture. You had 1.67, and
Now
you're
it's
getting
down to
this
1.
aspect. It's 1, but the other one had the direct.
Had the direct transfers in.
So actually, this is kind of suggesting there's quite a bit of effect.
Of spillover.
Spillover, that the other one was kind of suggesting 0.6, and this is kind of like, yeah.
Right, right. So this is suggesting a bigger spillover effect than it was before.
Right.
Okay? That's right. Okay, and so this is manufacturing payrolls. Now this is total payments in manufacturing. This is not, wages. And so what we're getting is we're getting a negative effect here in almost all these things. So you're not getting much of an effect. We've estimated this for weekly wages during this period or whatever, and it turns out we get a very strong positive effect on weekly wages. And when I show you the employment numbers, this is retail sales. Let me briefly talk about retail sales and I'll go to employment. Okay, so retail sales or whatever, we have to re-estimate these things to make sure we're on the same sample. Because the retail sales is only for 29, 33, 35, and 39. Okay, and so what we're getting is the per capita income number here is 0.99. This is the retail sales. Retail sales are typically about 52%. And so we're getting much higher numbers for the multiplier relative to the typical ratio. And so, I mean, the minus 1549, I don't know what the hell's going on there. So, okay, and so it looks like this money is being funneled into consumption. Okay, so we have some other measures or whatever. So let's see, personal, we already did that. Okay, so this is employment, okay? Now, when we go to employment and some of these other things, we can't do dollar for dollar things anymore because they're just not a dollar basis. So we switch to elasticities. One of the things about this, just to give you an idea what the elasticities are, I think I actually did this. Hang on, where is this? Oh, I did it in the paper, but I didn't do it here. The elasticity for income, for personal income, is about 0.1, somewhere in that kind of neighborhood or wherever. So this elasticity is getting pretty close to what the elasticity for income is. So, you know, for dollar, so this is a pretty good sized elasticity. But what we're getting here is that the payrolls are just not, they're just negative relationships here. The per capita payroll index, and this is the employment index, we're not getting a positive effect on employment. We're just getting it on income measures, not on employment. We do get a positive effect on automobiles. Okay, this is a pretty sizable elasticity. We did some back of the envelope calculations based on the idea that a new car costs about $500 during this period. If you do that, basically an additional dollar of federal spending got you about an additional 22 cents in the value of registrations, somewhere in that neighborhood. Okay, so those are the same thing. Okay, so that's the stuff we did there. Okay, so here's what we do. I wanted to give you a sense of what happens when you do it by state. Because one of the things that's going on here is you could take a state like Pennsylvania. A state like Pennsylvania was almost self-contained. I mean, they had just about every kind of production that you could name during this time period. They had almost every kind of agriculture, not quite, but almost every kind. They had mining, they had the whole thing. So if you talk about, if I was to pick a state that was most like the entire United States, Pennsylvania would be it. Okay, and so Pennsylvania might have a bigger multiplier than New York and some of these other states. All right, and so we decided to do this. So here's what we tried to do, because we can't do the same thing with individual states as we can with the panel. So first thing we tried to do is we wanted to mimic the state fixed effects, so we did first differences. Okay, then we wanted to take out the taxes, so we did grants minus taxes. Okay, and then we also needed a control for the aggregate shocks in the economy. So what we come up with is a measure of changes in M1, or maybe it's M2, changes in M2. We put an NRA dummy in there because Cole Nohanian spent a lot of time talking about the NRA, and we also put a time trend. Okay, and so when we estimate this with just the panel, if we estimate it using this model in the panel, we get a number of like 0.511 for the multiplier. So it turns out that 34 states reject a weak instrument bias. At the 10% level, they rejected at the 15% level, and 7 more. Okay, so there are about 41 states where we think we've got decent estimates. And then there are a group of states that are kind of all over the place that we cannot reject weak instrument bias. And actually, looking at the states, I think that this is an old set of results. So I think these are going to be the wrong ones. Yeah, these are not the right ones. I keep thinking I've replaced that slide. What happened? Okay, so anyway, I haven't replaced the slide. So don't pay attention to those numbers, because essentially what happens is the numbers range. We get about 10 states that are somewhere in the high ones, like between 1.5 to 2. And I was expecting those to all be large states, like New York, Pennsylvania, places like that. It turns out that 2/3 of the state in that top 10 group are states that are in the bottom half of the population distribution. And they include Idaho and some other states like that. So you're just kind of sitting there. I would have been really happy if they'd been large states, because it would have made sense. You know, I could have told you a story about it, but just not working that way. And then I get some states that actually have negative multipliers, a handful, that actually had decent strength on the instrument. And those states, some of them are large and some of them are small. So there's no, I haven't run regressions to try to pick it out, but there's no consistent thing that I can tell you about those states. I would be much happier if the large states had been the ones that had gotten it. So that's where we stand right now. So let's see. So here are the conclusions. So the 1930s are likely the largest multiplier you're going to find. All right? And so the reason is there's 14 to 25% unemployment. There's huge amounts of factory capacity that's unused during this period. So if there's any time you're going to expect government spending to have a big stimulus effect, this is the one. So what kind of multipliers we get? Well, we're using the state and year fixed effects with IVs. With the state income measure, you're going to get direct pass-through. So this is going to be kind of escalated a little bit, because you're going to get the dollar goes into the person. And so that's going to be $1 for that person's income, and then it's going to continue on. Okay, so the multiplier we get ranges from 0.87 for grants and loans to 1.67 for the non-AAA grants. I would emphasize the difference between the non-AAA and the AAA grants. These are big. I'd really like to be able to get at the difference between the pure transfers and the work relief. I haven't been able to do that yet. And the problem has been, it's hard enough to find one instrument for one thing and have instrument strength. When you go for two, and then have two of them and you're trying to sort out the differentials between the two, it gets even harder. When you go for three, it gets even more difficult, and one of the problems is that the relief spending and the public works spending tend to move together anyway. So they're reasonably positively correlated. So I haven't been able to sort those out. I have a gut feeling that I would have expected a stronger effect from the Public Works Administration that was paying full wages than I would from the WPA that was paying half wages. And the reason I argue that would be is the WPA is only getting you enough to get you to the bare minimum of income. So you're not really spending on the types of things that would actually roll over in the economy better and get more stimulus to manufacturing and things along those lines. So, but I have not been able to sort that out and separate that out in the context. Okay, so there's some worries about measurement error, and then, matter of fact, the IV can reduce the problem under some assumptions of measurement error. Of course, you can always find assumptions about measurement error where the IV doesn't solve this problem. So every time we think we've solved it, wherever we know that some new thing comes along and shows we haven't solved it. Drop the transfers. The wage and salary multipliers are between 3 and 0.101 for the non-AAA. So you actually get some spillover here. You get a strong negative effect of the AAA, which seems to show up over and over again. The final feature of this, retail spending on autos goes up. So that seems to be that some of this money seems to be going towards consumption, unlike in the modern period. But private payrolls and employment are showing really strong, they're not showing any positive effect at all. And one of the things that could be going on, and I haven't figured this out, something about what the federal government is doing with the spending and all the various other things seems to be propping up wages in ways that might lead to no change in employment. And where next? Okay, we're going to convert the personal income or whatever to try to get rid of this and try to go on that basis to try to see what happens without the transfer. I'm going to look at monthly earnings and also some savings and also the farm wages. And then hopefully one of these days I'm going to finish this paper and I'll never have to look at it again. So anyway, so thank you for having me. And so I hope it was only an hour and a half.
That's 2 hours, right?
Oh, it is? Okay, well, we can talk about the HOLC. I can talk to you about anything, you know. I can make up stuff about Angie's work.
Dave's work. So can we go back to the state-specific ones again?
Yeah, so these are the wrong numbers, but just to give you an idea. Do you want to see what
You want to see the wrong numbers?
Yeah, I want to see the wrong numbers.
Yeah, you want to see the wrong numbers.
You can make up some other ones if you want.
That's right. So,
But no, I just want to think about the identification stuff, which maybe goes back to some of what Paul was pushing. It's like, so why is the first stage working? You've got a trend in there for everybody, right?
right.
When you're doing each stage.
It turns out the trend doesn't make that much difference. So I can pull out a lot of these things and it doesn't change things too much.
Just
These
trying
are
to
pretty
think about
robust.
when your instrument is going to actually look strong in the first stage. And it seems like there's two possibilities. One is that there really is a movement, as Paul was talking about whether
Right.
you're a swing state or not. And then you would really want to talk about why that shift in being a swing state or not happened for that state.
Right, I agree with that.
But the other one is, to the extent that this kind of comes back again, it could be, maybe this is a good thing, you know, if they didn't change swing state status very much, right? Then your variation is really just variation
the time.
from the national, right? Well, to the extent that it's not linear. So if the national trend in the spending or whatever, right, was
Oh, definitely was non-linear.
Right, and so then it might actually be good because it sort of means where you're going to get the most strength is probably the states that are just getting their proportion of the total swing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some sense, they're getting something that really isn't very specific to the innovations that are going on with them, and then that might be good. So I would come back to Paul's idea of like trying one where you actually don't allow any, you know, you use a constant version of the swing measure.
So I went through a period where I actually did this where I didn't include the interaction with the swing state measure. And I didn't change it, or I didn't change it, either one. But the one I focused on for a while was I didn't change it at all. And so basically all I did was use the other area. The problem I ran into with that was it seemed to me that you needed the swing state story to some extent because you had to have a story of why something that was going on clear across the country would be correlated with what's happening in Washington after you control for the aggregate shocks, after you control for the year fixed effects. And I just wasn't able to tell a good story about why that was working. I could tell a story once I had the swing measure in there, because I could say, okay, this deviates, and then the swing measure goes, and then the swing measure blows it up. Now, maybe I don't need the swing changes, and so I can try it without the swing changes and see. And I'll try that too. I haven't tried that in a while since I've got the data and new things. So, but then one of the things about
again,
this,
I would do just to be very, very clean on it. Just exactly no variation in the swing measure, and just taking the aggregate of the national level also. Then you get
just try the national level total, right?
Exactly, all of that now.
And I was getting when I did that, I actually did it, and I was getting pretty similar results.
Yeah, it could be, that's exactly. It's an easier one to understand. That one I kind of get a good grasp on it and everything.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was just worried about this.
But people will argue with it for the exact reason that they'll say, oh, shouldn't you drop this measure?
Well, that's
it. We can discuss that. That's it.
Well, I've been through this. Matter of fact, I've seen this. Some papers do it, some papers don't. They argue about it and stuff. And so I did try it where I didn't take those out or whatever. And my memory is the results are pretty similar, but it's been a while since I've actually, and the data have been improved, and so it might change.
So in some sense, that part of the puzzle, I don't know how I'm reading this, is you have this, both in the personal income, you have the wage and salary, you have the retail sales, and kind of this, 0.5, 1.5, let's say, somewhere around there, it's kind of varying a bit. And then the surprising thing is there's no effect on employment.
Yeah.
Is that the way you're interpreting?
That's what's going on. And so what was going on, I was talking to David this morning about that, is that, Colin Ohanian spent a lot of time talking about high wage policies of the National Recovery Administration, and those are clearly designed to raise wages. But they take that off in 1935. Now, they claim that the National Labor Relations Act after that is a continuation of the high wage policies, but that's a tougher sell in this because it takes a while for labor to actually exercise its power. Matter of fact, they have to go through some strike activity and stuff, and they really, not until 37, and they make sure it's constitutional, do they actually really get to ramp up some. And even then, you're not affecting a huge amount of the economy. Something's going on, though, but remember, I said that I actually estimated this right. The federal spending was associated with higher weekly earnings. And so it could be that
more hours.
Maybe more hours for the people that go.
And so it may be that that's actually propping the wage up because there's something that's creating all this unemployment. And the only thing you can think out is something that's blocking you from causing wages to drop, right? But wages don't drop wages are pretty rigid in the manufacturing sector, but in all the other sectors, they're moving up and down all over the place. And so retail, wholesale, they're moving all over the place. But there's something that's going on that's holding those wages up that creates unemployment. And maybe some of this is going on. And it may be that this is actually helping prop up reservation wages for people because they want to stay on the WPA to make sure they've got a more stable job. Because some of these people stay on the WPA for 2 and 3 years. And they're worried about getting off the WPA and going to another job where the job's gone in 3 weeks and they've lost the WPA job. Now, the WPA spends a lot of time trying to tell them that they'll get their job back. But they don't seem to believe it. And matter of fact, the Newman, the paper with Todd, that Todd's the lead author on, we spend a lot of time talking about this kind of mismatch between what the WPA is saying and what the employers are saying. Because the employers are saying, look, we're having all these problems hiring workers. And the WPA people are saying, well, it's not because of us, because we're telling the workers to get off, and we're even providing them opportunities to get off, and making them get off, and things like this. And so what happens is that you start looking at the response functions, and they spread out over a period of time. And in a sense, both of them are right. The WPA cannot find evidence that they're holding on to people. But at the same time, the employers are still having problems trying to hire people or whatever. And so they're just talking about two different issues. And so the WPA is not doing anything wrong, in a sense. And the employers aren't lying. It's just that they're looking at two different situations in a different way. So they're kind of talking against each other. So, but I mean, no one's being able to explain why we have 25% unemployment, so I'm not alone. But I'd like to be able to resolve it so that I can become famous. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.